So you hear a lot about using Kveik yeast to ferment hot and fast. Well, I was wondering how Voss Kveik would do if fermented at standard ale temperatures. So I put that to the test. I split a batch, fermented half of it warm and half of it at a cool ale temperature. Well, let's get into it and see how they turned out. Well, my name is Brent, and I appreciate you stopping by Cascades Homebrew. So have you ever tried fermenting a Kveik yeast cool? Is there any reason to do so? So I was curious about that myself, so I gave it a try. So I've used Voss several times. Sometimes I use a heater wrap to keep it warm in the 85-90 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 to 32 degrees Celsius range. I've also fermented some batches with Voss just kind of at a warm room temperature, say around 76-78 degrees Fahrenheit or that 24 to 26 degrees Celsius range. So for this trial, I figured I'd try splitting a batch, fermenting half of it warmer around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees Celsius. And then the other half, I would use temperature control to ferment it kind of like a standard ale temperature, so around 65 degrees Fahrenheit or 18 degrees Celsius. I guess I was curious, would that cool temperature produce a clean beer? Would Kveik even work well at a cool temperature? So is there any advantage to using a Kveik strain like Voss at a cool ale temperature versus using a kind of a clean ale yeast, say US-05 or maybe something else? So this was a new recipe I put together, and I was really happy with how it turned out. So I decided to put out a separate video where I talked a little bit more detail about the recipe and the brew date and then the evaluation. So if you want more details about the batch, make sure you check out that video. For this video, I'm going to focus more about the fermentation and then come back and taste the two beers and see how they compare. So just to jog your memory about the batch, so this was a summer blonde ale, I'm calling it. It was a fairly hoppy blonde ale, 5.5 gallons into the fermenter, 21 liters. Bitterness around 40 IBUs. Color was 4.5, so kind of a light colored. I built the recipe around 73% efficiency, which would have given me an original gravity 1042, final gravity of a 1011, which would have been an ABV of 4.2. Actually came a little higher in my original gravity, so I think as a ABV was around 4.6 on this one. So the grain bill on this one, 91.5 of an American pale malt, 2-row, 5.7% of Gambrinus honey malt, 2.9% of Weyermann Carafoam. For the hops on this one, it was a 30-minute boil, and at the start of the boil, I got a 1/4 ounce or 7 grams of Warrior. With 5 minutes left in the boil, I added 1/2 ounce each or 14 grams of Citra and Brew 1, and then I did a hop steep at 170 degrees Fahrenheit or 77 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes. For that, I added 1.5 ounce or 42 grams of each Citra and Brew 1. So the goal here was a nice light ABV but hoppy beer. So jumping in at the end of the brew day, so the yeast for this one was Mangrove Jack M12. It's a dry version of Voss. This is a pack I picked up at the 2022 Homebrew Con. I divided the 10-gram pack in half into 2 sanitized cups and sprinkled directly onto the wort. So note, at this point, the wort in both fermenters was around 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius. So looking back, maybe I should have waited for the cool fermented batch to chill down to my target fermentation temperature before adding the yeast, but I went ahead and added the yeast at the warmer temperature. It only took about 2 hours for that 2.5 gallon batch to get down to the target fermentation temperature. So as I mentioned, the target for the warm batch was 85 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius. The target for the cool fermented batch was 65 degrees Fahrenheit or 18 degrees Celsius. So looking closer at the fermentation, so I'd pitched the yeast around 3:30 p.m. When I came in at around the 8-hour mark to check on the fermenters, the warm fermented batch was acting like a typical Kveik yeast. It was really chugging away at top speed. The cool fermented batch was just kind of showing some signs of fermentation. The wort was sort of, it was sure interesting looking at this point. So checking back in the following morning, at about 16 hours after pitching the yeast, the warm fermented batch is looking like it's almost done fermenting. I wish I had a floating hydrometer, like a tilt, to better capture fermentation data. The cool fermented batch had started picking up speed at this point. It was acting kind of like your typical active ale yeast fermentation, so definitely not as strong as the hot fermented Kveik, but looking pretty good. So on day 3, I decided to take a gravity reading of the cool fermenting batch, just kind of to make sure it was on target and the yeast was performing fine. So I measured around 1013, which ended up being about 2 points over the final gravity, so it was getting pretty close. I did notice some mild sulfur notes in the cool fermented batch at this point. At this point, I was pretty sure the warm fermented batch was done fermenting, but the cool one was still working, so I gave it 2 more days to clean up. I usually only cold crash my dry hop beers, but since I was taking this one out to a camp out, there was a good chance that it would get moved around. I figured cold crashing would reduce the amount of sediment in the keg, and hopefully less of that would get stirred up with moving the keg. So on day 6, I went ahead and kegged the beers. So the warm fermented batch, it was definitely ready to be kegged. I might have rushed the cool fermented batch just a little to get it in time, but it seemed like it was in pretty good shape. So at this point, my impressions of fermenting warm, Voss Kveik is a real beast. It finished up really fast. But when it was fermented cool at a standard ale temperature, it definitely moved along at a pretty good rate, kind of like an aggressive ale yeast, maybe like a Nottingham yeast. So as I mentioned, with the final stats, I came a little bit higher in my original gravity, so I was at 1046. My attenuation was right about on target, so I ended up measuring the same final gravity for both the warm and the cool fermented batches, so that gave me an ABV of 4.6%. So I took the keg of the warm fermented one along with me to Camp Mash Out. Quite a bit of it got drunk there, so I was sure to fill a couple bottles. So this bottle, I did cap it on foam, but looks like there was quite a bit of headspace in there, so hopefully the carbonation is fine. I'm going to go ahead and crack these open, and I'm going to pour them into glasses. So I went ahead and marked the glasses on the bottom, and I'm going to try to taste them without knowing exactly which one is which. I don't know if there'll be a visual difference between the two beers. This one is the cool fermented batch, and this one is the warm fermented batch. So right off the bat, they look pretty identical. So I'm going to go ahead, mix these up a little bit so I don't know which one is which. So I mixed the two glasses up a little bit, so I'm not quite sure which one is which. I'll go ahead and put a label on the screen so you'll know which is which. Like I mentioned, appearance, they both are identical, which is good for this kind of test since I don't want to be able to tell just by looking at them. They're kind of a nice, I would say, either light gold, dark straw color, fairly clean, both of them. There's a bit of condensation on the glasses, which is interfering a little bit with the clarity of appearance. So I'm first going to see if I can get a difference in the aroma. So typically what I would think, warm fermented Voss should have maybe a little bit more of orange character. Cool fermented Voss should maybe be a little bit cleaner, but I'm not sure. That's what we're going to try. So initial thoughts, I definitely get the hop aroma. I definitely get some citrus, whether that's from the hops or that's from the yeast. It's hard to tell. It smells very nice. This one, initial thoughts are less. Yeah, I mean, I definitely would say this one I'm getting more citrusy character. Citrusy freeze seems really reasonably noticeable. So it'd be interesting if I'm on target here with that this one maybe is the warm fermented one. But initial thoughts on aroma, that this one had definitely more esters, more kind of orange character along with it. They both smell nice. They're nice hoppy beers. There's definitely quite a bit of hop presence in them. Not really getting kind of, I guess I get a little bit, maybe kind of a sweet malty aroma in both of them. All right, so we'll go and try to take a taste. All right, so that initial one, I get a lot of what I usually consider kind of some of that Voss character, just a little bit of a kind of a sweet orange kind of character. Very nice beer. So I'm definitely getting a little different character in the flavor on these two. So the one here on my right, your left, I get this kind of sweet orange character. It's kind of what I associate with Voss and my experiences in the past. This one still got a lot of nice kind of citrus flavor, both from probably some of it's from the yeast and some of it's from the hops. I feel like you get a little bit more of kind of the grain character kind of shows through. So after taking a taste of them, my thoughts are kind of similar. That this one is probably the warm fermented one. It's just got a little bit more of that kind of sweet orange character. It kind of adds it definitely I feel like it adds a level of kind of sweetness to the beer. So that's one thing I've found with Voss beers in the past. Usually I've always fermented them warm. I always felt they had this kind of little bit of a sweetness to them. Whereas this one, it's a nice beer. They're both really nice beers. I have no complaints about either of them. This one just is a little bit more clean, a little less of that citrus. Doesn't taste quite as that, doesn't quite have that kind of sweet character that you get from the kind of sweet orangey. So let me take a look, see if I'm right or wrong. Yep, so that one's the warm fermented, and that one's the cool fermented. All right, so for me, this was very interesting. So I say I tasted these together very early on. I took some bottles of the cool fermented along to the camp out, and I tasted them there, but the beers were very young and they're still a bit hazy. So I was curious after they aged a little bit in the bottle, if they'd end up being like very similar, or maybe they'd retain some differences. So I think I've probably during the tasting kind of said my overall. Like I said, Voss fermented warm. This is one of those experiments that just kind of turned out the way that I almost expected it to be. I just got more of that orange, more of that citrus, that sweetness, just a little more esters in this one when it was fermented warm. So the cool fermented Voss is an interesting one because it definitely has less of that orange. The yeast still performed quite well. I mean, I had this in the keg less than a week. And maybe realistically, I should have given it a couple more days, but you know, grain to keg in a week, including cold crash, I mean, that's fine. So I'd say if you don't particularly like that orange character in Voss, maybe fermenting cool would be a way to suppress that. Also, I'd say if you don't have a way to keep the fermenter like hot, although you can do that pretty cheap, but if you don't really want to do that, or if you don't have the means to keep the fermenter hot, to me this kind of shows you could put a batch with Voss, put it down in your basement where it's cool. It works well, it works pretty fast, it's pretty aggressive yeast even at cool temperatures. The beer turned out well. So I don't have a strong preference for either of these. They're both, this one just showcases some of that citrus character, which again, to me, it always melds well with kind of hoppy beers. This one just shows more of a cleaner yeast character. It'd be interesting, like side by side with US-05 with like a cool fermented Voss. Seems to show that Voss Kveik is a pretty versatile yeast. I'm looking forward to doing some more trials, I think especially with like Lutra, some different temperatures and some different style beers. So maybe I'll include some stuff more with Voss, like maybe using Voss in like a porter or a brown ale or an amber ale or something other than just a hoppy beer and see how they turn out. So if you like these kind of trials, make sure you check out the other content. If you're interested in how I brewed the first batch, make sure you check out that video as well. And if my content is helping you build some great beers, click that thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. Cheers!